Today I want to talk about prose, or more specifically, this idea that I keep seeing that modern prose is just terrible. So I have seen a lot on social media recently of just different people, posting videos or articles or whatever, their thoughts on this idea that modern prose is becoming worse and worse. And I often see people complain about writers like Brandon Sanderson is the big one who gets a lot of hits on his prose. And Sarah J. Maas is another one. I've seen tons of complaints about her prose and it being repetitive and that kind of thing. And then there's the whole argument that many books today are written at a really low grade, like sixth grade reading level. And people will, hold up one of the old classic greats and talk about how much better that prose was than what we're seeing today. But I actually think that the debate isn't what we're making it. I think it's not really about prose, or only very little about prose, but also about some other things. We're sort of mixing and mashing together these different ideas that go along with like changes in publishing and changes in readers and changes in culture and even just changes in what readers want right now. And when we bring all that stuff together and think about it alongside this case of prose becoming terrible, it changes the argument a bit. So first off, when I see a lot of these debates, I don't usually see people actually even define what good prose is. And I think that that's probably because that's a very difficult thing to do. It's like with all of art, trying to say like what makes art good versus bad, that's very difficult. But I do think that we can talk about how there are different types of prose and that they're good for different reasons, and we can at least let this idea come into the conversation and be part of it. I want to talk about three types of prose that I think every author uses to some extent, but different authors rely more heavily or have the purpose of using one type more than the others. And it's often these different types that are part of our arguments about what makes prose good or bad. The first type is what I'm going to call beautiful prose, and this is the prose that's like musical. It has a rhythm, it has a sound to it. It's almost like poetry in the level of beauty that the sentences and paragraphs can convey just in sound and feeling as you read. And when people don't like this type of prose, they tend to refer to it as being too flowery. But when it's done really well and people enjoy it, then I think it can often be presented as some of the best prose ever written. For an example of this, I will go to the master himself, Ray Bradbury, who I think personally is perfect at this. I love Bradbury's prose. I think he is masterful above anyone else, especially considering that I think a lot of what he wrote was written on a typewriter I think it was written on a typewriter. I know it was written in the library and he had to pay like a dime for, however much time, and he didn't have that much money, so he was trying to write really quickly and he writes this unbelievable prose. Here's an example from his short story, All Summer in a Day. Most people have read this. It's one of my favorites. It's so great. This is when the kids come out into the sun for the first time after, being in the rain for like 7 years. They stopped running and stood in the great jungle that covered Venus, that grew and never stopped growing, tumultuously, even as you watched it. It was a nest of octopi, clustering up great arms of flesh-like weed, wavering, flowering in this brief spring. It was the color of rubber and ash, this jungle, from the many years without sun. It was the color of stones and white cheeses and ink. and it was the color of the moon. The children lay out laughing on the jungle mattress and heard it sigh and squeak under them, resilient and alive. They ran among the trees, they slipped and fell, they pushed each other, they played hide and seek and tag, but most of all, they squinted at the sun until the tears ran down their faces. They put their hands up to that yellowness and that amazing blueness, and they breathed of the fresh, fresh air and listened to the silence, which suspended them in a blessed sea of no sound and no motion. They looked at everything and savored everything. Then, wildly, like animals escaped from their caves, they ran in shouting circles. They ran for an hour and did not stop running. You can really see with this type of writing that Bradbury is trying to give a particular flow and sound to his sentences. The repetition that he does often, things like saying the fresh, fresh air, and they listened and listened. He wants it to have a feeling, and I think he's extremely successful. So when I'm talking about beautiful musical prose, I'm talking about somebody like Bradbury, who you can pick out a sentence and talk about how great it sounds. And reading him almost feels like reading a poem, because he's so like lyrical and he has such a cadence in his writing that goes along with whatever's happening in the story. It's really easy to focus on his sentences, whereas some people really enjoy that. Other people find it distracting or will say that it's overwritten. The next type of prose that I'm going to talk about is immersive prose, and we can think of this as the prose that's really evocative. And this is prose that is going to, usually people who are great at creating atmosphere are using this type of prose. And it's the type that allows the reader to feel like physically present in a scene and to really get into sensations, smells, what you hear, what you feel, and emotion as well. So again, every author does this to a point because you have to have description that makes the reader understand what's going on, and you want your reader to understand the emotions of your characters. But some authors just focus a lot more on really diving deep into this and doing a lot with it. And they will focus on getting like just the exact right word to get to an experience or a feeling, or to really let somebody see or hear what's happening in that moment. I have two examples here because they're two kind of different examples. One is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and the other one is Blackmouth, a horror novel by Ronald Malfi, which I actually just started reading and I haven't even finished yet. In case you don't know, Piranesi is about a man who is in this sort of giant mansion castle world with a bunch of statues in it. It's maze-like and strange. The major atmosphere points here for Susanna Clarke in making this cool, mazy, dreamlike world. I'm going to read a small part where Piranesi is considering the insignificance of knowledge. When I tried to retrace those steps, my mind kept returning to the image of the 192nd Western Hall in the moonlight, to its beauty, to its deep sense of calm, to the reverent looks on the faces of the statues as they turned, or seemed to turn, towards the moon. I realized that the search for the knowledge has encouraged us to think of the house as if it were a sort of riddle to be unraveled, a text to be interpreted, and that if ever we discovered the knowledge, then it will be as if the value has been wrested from the house, and all that remains will be mere scenery. The sight of the 192nd Western Hall in the moonlight made me see how ridiculous that is. The house is valuable because it is the house. It is enough in and of itself. It is not the means to an end. This is a great passage. You can see some of that musicality that I talked about with Bradbury here with Clark as well. But I think even more so, she is describing this visual element, but through Piranesi, we're getting a much more layered and deeper metaphor that we can also see visually, like imagine really well. So this is just excellent writing, in my opinion. This idea of seeing this beautiful maze-like house with all these statues and birds and waterfalls, and then thinking about how it's something so deep and meaningful, and we can see it that way as almost like alive versus something that's just scenery, right? Something that's like, it's just furniture, it's just a house, but it's not anything more deeper and alive. This is about so much more than just this house that she has created here in Piranesi, but it's about the world and our lives and the ways that we can experience so many different things. So this is a type of writing that it really brings you into the moment and it lets you really feel it and be there. And with Susanna Clark, she's so excellent because her writing is also so layered and meaningful. So it's not even just about this one scene, but it's about so much more than that. And that's why I think that she's considered to be such an amazing writer by so many people, because that's something that's really difficult to do, this layered type of writing. So the next example I want to talk about is Blackmouth by Ronald Malfi. So again, I'm not even done with this yet, but I think that Malfi is really good. He's not like Clark, and his writing isn't as layered and metaphorical as hers is, but he's great at atmosphere and he's great at picking like the perfect word. He doesn't need to use 10 words for you to be able to be in a place or feel the thing that he wants you to feel. He gets right down to that one word that I feel like one or two that work just perfectly. In the summer of my 11th year, a monster came to Blackmouth. It came in the night, slinking below the sight line of normal folks, destined to arrive at the threshold of my youth. Perhaps it sought me out the way a bloodhound tracks a scent, or perhaps it was sheer happenstance, a flip of a coin, a flutter of distant butterfly wings. Events in our lives often have meaning because we choose to give them meaning. Whatever the case, it arrived in the way monsters sometimes do, as a creature in need. A clash of thunder, a deluge of rain, some indistinct sense of wrongness roused me from a fitful sleep. I rolled over in a bed damp with sweat, just as a flash of lightning pulsed against the bedroom window. Briefly, Dennis's silhouette stood in sharp relief against the dazzle of a storm-churned sky. It was the hottest summer in 100 years, or so the old-timers in the quay attested, and Dennis and I had taken to sleeping with our bedroom window open because of the old farmhouse's HVAC unit was on the fritz again. So with Malfi, I think, again, we can see it's not quite as deep and layered as Susanna Clark, but I would still put him in this immersive prose. Like, I think that's a big focus of his because of the language that he uses and the atmosphere. So the first paragraph I read, you can really see the atmosphere with this idea of the monster coming during his 11th year at the threshold of his youth. That gives a really like creepy, destined, freaky situation in this like coming of age type situation. And then the next paragraph I read is him waking up from sleep during a storm, and I think with that paragraph you can really see like the language that he uses and how it emphasizes the storm, and you really feel like you're in the storm. You're there with the main character, like waking up and feeling it and seeing what's happening and the heat of this hot summer. He goes on to talk about like the soggy sheets and then steps on the wet floor. and it's just very immersive writing. So this type of writing is the kind that I think a lot of people really love when they're talking about looking for prose that's well done. But I also think that there's a lot of people, and especially when it's not done as well, it can feel overwritten, and it can feel like too detailed sometimes. Malfi, I think, does a great job with it. But I think sometimes with some authors, you start to feel dragged down by their attempt to make something immersive. The final type of prose that I want to talk about, because obviously this list is not exhaustive. We could talk about prose in so many different ways, and you could add a million more categories, but I'm just trying to make a point and get to these three main things that I see a lot. So the last type then I would call transparent prose, which is the type of prose that's trying to be invisible. You're not supposed to notice it. You're not supposed to look at the sentence and say, oh, what a beautiful sentence. That's not what the author's intent is. The author wants the prose to just be a vehicle for the story. You really should be in the story and not focusing on the prose at all. It shouldn't be noticeable. And again, as I said, these overlap. Even authors who focus on this type of transparent prose are still gonna especially be doing evocative prose as well, because they're still going to be doing description and want you to understand a scene. It's just going to be with a slightly different focus than I think the immersive prose focus is. And so this is somebody like Brandon Sanderson. He's actually described his prose this way, and now people will argue that his prose isn't good, and I don't really want to get into that, but I think that there are other writers who do this type of prose who are considered great writers. One of them is Elmore Leonard, who I haven't actually even read a full book by him, but I know that he is known for having more straightforward, simpler prose, and I have read part of a book by him, and I'll use an excerpt to show you. And then also somebody like Agatha Christie or Michael Crichton, who are all considered great writers, and they have much simpler, straightforward prose. And we can even think about somebody like Hemingway, who is an author who I think is very precise with his language, and he's doing something purposefully with his prose. I think he's different than some of these other authors and what he's doing with his prose, but I think we could still talk about him to try to kind of help understand this idea. So let's look at Sanderson first. I just picked a random scene from Mistborn that I thought would present this approach, because I didn't really feel like I needed to try to find something that works really well, because it's just, the idea is that it's not that noticeable. Cameron studied the building with a critical eye. Vin could sense his apprehension. The Canton of Finance was hardly the most threatening of ministry offices. The Canton of Inquisition, or even the Canton of Orthodoxy, had a far more ominous reputation. However, voluntarily entering any ministry office, putting yourself in the power of the obligators, well, it was a thing to do only after serious consideration. Cameron took a deep breath, then strode forward, his dueling cane tapping against the stones as he walked. He wore his rich nobleman's suit, and he was accompanied by a half-dozen crew members, including Vin, to act as his servants. Vin followed Cameron up the stairs, then waited as one of the crew members jumped forward to pull the door open for his master. Of the 6 attendants, only Vin seemed to have been told nothing of Cameron's plan. Suspiciously, Theron, Cameron's supposed partner in the ministry scam, was nowhere to be seen. Vin entered the Canton building. Vibrant red light, sparkling with lines of blue, fell from the rose window. A single obligator, with medieval tattoos around his eyes, sat behind a desk at the end of the extended entryway. Cameron approached, his cane thumping against the carpet as he walked. So this is literally just some description as they're entering this building, but I do think you get some of that. you get some atmosphere and you get description, but it's not in the same way that you would get it in immersive prose, or what I was calling immersive prose. It's a lot lighter. So you get that this is creepy because you kind of have Vin's perspective of going into these types of buildings and how like that's not something you really want to do. So you get that little bit of atmosphere of this being dangerous and scary, but there's not a lot of description that's trying to create that atmosphere. And then you also get, you know, some other description, the cane tapping and the window, the colors from the window, and the tattoos on the obligators around his eyes. But this isn't very deep description. It's just to let the reader understand the situation, see the room, and be able to move forward in the text of Vin going into this dangerous situation. So it's a lot more straightforward kind of writing. Okay, and finally we can look at somebody like Hemingway, who I think actually might be more of like a hybrid between the invisible prose and the immersive prose, because I think Hemingway's prose can be more layered and have more depth, but I also think it's often really straightforward, especially with his descriptions. So I'm looking at just a couple of pages from The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and I'm just going to read one little piece of description and then a different section, which is more the character's thoughts. He lay then and was quiet for a while and looked across the heat shimmer of the plain to the edge of the bush. There were a few Tommies that showed minute and white against the yellow, and far off he saw a herd of zebra, white against the green of the bush. This was a pleasant camp under big trees against a hill, with good water, and close by a nearly dry water hole where sandgrouse flighted in the mornings. I don't think Hemingway's really trying to do much other than just sort of give you the setting, and kind of that this guy is watching these animals, and it's very basic. He's just saying things were this way, this way, this way, and that's it. So I think that's more of a straightforward type of prose. Then we have a more deeper and layered prose next. Although I still wouldn't say that it's at the level of musical, and it's not like these huge metaphors. So now it was all over, he thought. So now he would never have a chance to finish it. So this was the way it ended, in a bickering over a drink. Since the gangrene started in his right leg, he had no pain, and with the pain the horror had gone, and all he felt now was a great tiredness and anger, that this was the end of it. For this, that now was coming, he had very little curiosity. For years it had obsessed him, but now it meant nothing in itself. It was strange how easy being tired enough made it. Now he would never write the things he had saved to write until he knew enough to write them well. Well, he would not have to fail at trying to write them either. Maybe you could never write them, and that was why you put them off and delayed the starting. Well, he would never know now. So even Hemingway has this sort of like repetition that I don't think is used in a way to be musical like it is with Bradbury or Clark. He keeps saying the word well, but he's mixing it up with the idea of writing well, like well as in goodness, and then well as just like an utterance of the character. Well, I'll never do that now. He uses pretty simple language. He uses the word things and very and a great tiredness and all that type of stuff. But I think there's still a level of depth to this paragraph, even with the language being simpler and pretty straightforward, because the thoughts are really straightforward of this man who is dying of gangrene. But it's deeper than that because it's trying to get into this thought process that we can have in the instance of death. This guy has thought about his death before and worried about it, but now that it's gotten to the point where it's coming, he's surprised in the way that he really feels about it, in almost like the stupidity of it and how it's not a grand moment and how he's just tired, and that wasn't something that he ever would have expected about his own death. So it gives us as the reader something to really consider in a different way to explore the thought of death, and that's where it's deeper, because it's sort of holding you in this thought process rather than just carrying you forward with action. So it's much different than somebody like Sanderson, but it is still that straightforward, simplistic language that I don't think Hemingway wants us to be focusing on the sentences as much as just what the character is thinking and displaying the description. Now, I don't think any of these three types are better or worse, and like I said, I do think they're intermingled in all texts, but I just think they're different types of books when somebody is really focusing on the musicality of their prose or the immersiveness or the invisibility of their prose. It's a novel that's trying to do something different, and it's not it doesn't necessarily mean it's a novel that's trying to do something better or worse. So my second point is then that we have to pay attention to what the prose is doing and why, because that's part of why people read. People read for different purposes, and that is something we have to consider when we're considering what an author is doing with the prose. Some people want a Ray Bradbury experience and they love it, and they look for books that have that like lyricism to them. And as I said, a lot of other people don't like that because they feel like it's like too flowery and distracting. And other readers really love having an atmospheric novel and just like diving into the scene and just like being inside it, and they like having more description. And I think fantasy readers a lot of times end up being like this because they care about the world building and they want to be immersed in it, so they like a heavier level of description and focus on a lot of sensory things in the writing. But other people don't like that as much because they feel like it slows the pace down more than is necessary for a story. But I do think it tends to lend itself more to this type of layered writing that we saw with Susanna Clarke, where you can do something a little bit deeper with the story when you're focused on having it be more immersive type of prose. But then there's writers like Sanderson who has a more simplistic, straightforward, you're not supposed to be really noticing the prose, he just wants it to carry you along, and so you know like what's happening, the events, what the characters are thinking. And that I think tends to lead to faster pace novels, which sometimes people just want that more. And it doesn't mean that you can't still have a layered approach, even though I don't think Sanderson is even trying to do that. That's something that Hemingway is looking at his prose like more artistically and like trying to do something layered with it, whereas I don't think Sanderson is trying to do that. But you can still see that this simpler, more straightforward prose is capable of doing something well with the prose, even if we're not really noticing the prose. So that brings me back to the point of like this divisiveness with a lot of modern writing and people arguing that it's not as good or that it's terrible compared to the older standards. And sometimes I think part of that argument doesn't necessarily come about from writing that's bad. It just comes about from writing that has a different purpose and that writing that's trying to be a little bit more transparent. And people are automatically seeing that as bad. Now, I don't think that's always the case. You can critique the transparent type of writing, and you can also critique the musical type or the immersive type or a mix of those. But I do think it's something that's not often brought up or really considered, and it is something that we should be thinking about when we're critiquing prose. So we can come back to the question of, is prose getting worse today than it used to be? And in my opinion, which is not backed up by research, but just by my experience, and I mean, some things that I've seen that other people have said, I don't really think that it is getting worse. I think that there are some other things that changed that also are making it seem worse. And one thing is publishing. Anyone can publish their books now. There's way more books being published now than there ever was before, which takes away gatekeepers and makes it a lot easier for people who aren't as good writers to put their stuff out there, and anyone can see it and pick it up. So I think less experienced writers are just putting out books. And so in that sense, yeah, there's more bad books, but there's more books. So we have to like think about it in terms of the availability of the product. But then again, I also think that there's more opportunity for people who want to do like more creative and artistic type of prose and different types of things with their stories. There's more of an opportunity for people to do that, because if you go to a publisher and they're like, no, this is too weird, I'm not publishing it, then you can just publish it yourself. So I also think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff that you can find. You just have to like dig deeper and kind of be looking for things that are going against the norm. The other change is that I think what people want has changed, at least at this moment. And I don't think it'll necessarily stay this way forever, unless we fall into the movie Idiocracy, which could possibly happen. Hopefully not. But if we don't do that, then I think that things can change again. But right now in the culture, people have really been into faster pacing and this cleaner prose type with less description. They want the story to move along, and that feels better to them. So I think that's part of why we're seeing some of this type of prose happening more. And then whether it's good or bad, we can talk about that. But it's a prose that just is simpler than classic literature of the past often is. And so since this is popular, those are the books that we see the most. They're the most easily accessible because they're what everybody's talking about. They're what we see on our timelines and everything everywhere. And the more stylistic stuff is just not getting read as much. It's hard to find that stuff. It's harder to find it now than it is to find something that's written with this other type of transparent prose. That's not to say that what readers want can't make a whole book more simplistic. So like I said, I think the books that are more popular tend to have more straightforward or even simpler prose. But I will agree that a lot of popular books are also simpler stories, and it's not just about the prose. And that comes from people having shorter attention spans and more fragmented focus, and just the constant digital entertainment. It's just changing the way that we can focus and consume things, and like the patience we have to follow a story. That's going to make it so that there's people putting stories out for the general audience that have this sort of level of focus, and then those stories aren't going to be as deep. But as I said, I still think there are also authors out there who want to write more stylistically, and who do, and who publish those things. And there are authors who want to be deeper. They do that as well, but they're just not getting the recognition that the simpler stories are. It's not as simple as, are authors capable of writing the beautiful prose that they wrote in the past? I think it's a much bigger question that's about what we value as readers and what we're being served because of what we're asking for. But I think it's really easy to harp on the prose because you can just pull out a sentence and say, look at how bad that is. But you could really do that with every author, no matter how good they are. Like, people can pull out sentences of Shakespeare and be like, this sounds like trash. Because there's so much more to a story than just like one sentence. So it seems easy to just criticize the prose, but I really think you have to look at it in combination of the whole story and a bunch of different things about what the author is doing and why. And we also, again, have to look at the bigger picture of what the audience wants that we need to consider in this discussion, like commercial success and popularity versus what's actually out there as well. Because, I mean, these books weren't written that long ago, and I think that they're both beautifully written. But I would like it if there were more musical and immersive prose writers who could find popularity soon, because I enjoy all types of prose and all types of stories. The point of this video was really just to look at some different types of prose, think about what it's doing, think about how it can be good or bad, and how I think we can expand the question, or we should expand it, or we should consider more different elements about prose when we're having this debate about, is prose worse in the modern day, because there's so much to the story that can make the purpose of the way the prose is written what it is. So I hope that made sense, and I hope you liked it. And if you have any thoughts, even if they're, hey, your argument got garbled at the end there, that you feel like responding to, I would love to hear them, because I just like to talk about this stuff and think about it, and I like disagreements just as much as people saying this was great. So feel free to comment. I'll probably be coming up with a video soon on Blackmouth because I'm reading this and I'm really loving it. So if you are interested, that should be happening soonish. Subscribe, do all the stuff, and that's it. See ya.